How does a player who isn't even touching the floor still run the entire sport? That's the question nobody wants to say out loud, because once you ask it, the answers get uncomfortable. Caitlin Clark wasn't playing. She wasn't dropping 30. She wasn't chasing records or lighting up box scores. In fact, for long stretches, she was stuck on the bench, sidelined, watching. And yet, while she was inactive, something strange happened. Ticket prices moved. TV schedules shifted. Corporations adjusted strategy. Billionaires started placing quiet bets. Entire markets reacted as if she never left. 5 years ago, this would have sounded ridiculous. The idea that a women's basketball player could outdraw champions, overpower legacy brands, and force media networks to reorganize their priorities without even playing would have been laughed off as hype. Back then, women's sports were still fighting for scraps of coverage. The conversation was always about growth potential, never dominance. About momentum, never leverage. But this isn't hype anymore. It's pressure. Because what's happening now doesn't follow normal sports rules. It doesn't even follow normal celebrity rules. Caitlin Clark isn't just popular. She isn't just trending. She's operating in a space where attention behaves differently. Where absence doesn't weaken demand, it sharpens it. Where not playing doesn't pause the machine, it accelerates it. That's the part most people missed. While debates rage online about who deserves credit for the rise of women's basketball, the market already made its decision. Quietly, ruthlessly, without asking permission. Numbers started stacking up in places fans don't usually look. Not highlight reels. Not hot takes. But ownership moves. Investment signals. Collectibles data. Broadcast strategy. The stuff that doesn't care about opinions. And when you line those signals up, they all point in one direction. Caitlin Clark isn't riding a wave. She is the wave. But to understand how big this really is, you have to start with the most confusing part of all. The moment when everything should have slowed down, and instead exploded. Because the first real sign didn't come from a game. It came from her absence. And that's where this story actually begins. In sports, absence usually kills momentum. Fans move on fast. Media attention shifts. Narratives dry up. Injuries are supposed to be pauses. A reset button. We've seen it happen to stars across every league. A player goes down, ratings dip, conversation cools, and by the time they return, the spotlight has already moved somewhere else. That's how it's supposed to work. But Caitlin Clark didn't follow that script. And that's where things start getting strange. When she went down, the expectation was simple. Interest would soften. Ticket demand would level out. The noise would calm down until she came back. Instead, the opposite happened. Her absence didn't reduce demand. It exposed how much of the demand was tied to her alone. Games she wasn't playing in saw dramatic drops in ticket sales. Not small dips. Not normal fluctuations. Massive declines. The kind that forces people to ask uncomfortable questions. When one player stepping away causes a 70+% swing in ticket demand, that's no longer a team issue or a league issue. That's gravity. And gravity doesn't ask for permission. What made this even more unsettling was that the attention didn't disappear. It redirected. Conversations didn't stop. They intensified. Social timelines still revolved around her. Clips from old games kept circulating. Debates about her impact only got louder. Instead of cooling off, the narrative tightened around one idea. Everything feels different when she's not there. That's not normal fandom behavior. That's dependency. In most leagues, no single player holds that kind of leverage. Even the biggest names share oxygen with rivals, storylines, and championships. But here, something else was happening. Caitlin Clark wasn't just a star inside the system. She was becoming a reference point for the system itself. People weren't asking how the league was doing. They were asking how the league was doing without her. That distinction matters. Because once a player becomes the measuring stick, the structure has already shifted. The league stops being the product. The player becomes the product. And here's the part that really broke the pattern. While she wasn't playing, her value didn't stall. It multiplied. Markets that don't care about narratives, only demand, started moving harder in her direction. Collectors chased her name. Broadcasters leaned into her future return. Brands adjusted timelines around her availability. None of that requires her to be on the court. It only requires belief that when she comes back, the payoff will be bigger than the wait. That belief is everything. This is what invisible dominance looks like. Influence that doesn't rely on presence. power that operates even when the source is quiet. It's the same phenomenon seen with the rarest cultural figures, the ones who don't need constant exposure to stay relevant. Their name alone keeps the engine running. And that's when the shift becomes impossible to ignore. Because once attention behaves this way, stats stop mattering as much. Wins and losses become secondary. The conversation moves upstream, away from performance and toward pull. Toward the question executives, networks, and investors actually care about. Who moves people? Caitlin Clark answered that without saying a word. And the clearest proof didn't show up on television. It showed up somewhere far more honest. Because when hype fades, collectors remain. And when collectors move, the truth usually follows. That's where this story goes next. If you really want to know who matters in sports, don't look at highlights. Don't look at social media debates. And definitely don't listen to talking heads arguing narratives back and forth. The clearest answers usually come from places that don't care about feelings at all. One of those places is the collectibles market. This is where emotion meets money, and money doesn't lie. Trading cards aren't nostalgia anymore. They're data. They're speculation. They're long-term bets on cultural relevance. People don't send cards to be graded because they like a player. They do it because they believe that name will still matter years from now. And the company that sits at the center of that world is PSA. PSA doesn't create hype. It measures it. They grade millions of cards a year across every major sport. Basketball, football, baseball, hockey. When their yearly rankings drop, it's a snapshot of who actually commands attention when wallets are involved. It's one thing to trend online. It's another thing to make people pull cards out of storage, pay grading fees, and wait months just to get a slab with your name on it. That's commitment. So when PSA released their latest numbers, the sports world should have stopped and paid attention. Because buried inside that report was a stat so wild it barely made sense at first glance. Caitlin Clark became the most collected active basketball player on the planet. Not women's basketball. Not the WNBA. Basketball. Period. Pause on that. She didn't creep into the top 5. She didn't land somewhere respectable near the top. She cleared the field. She passed every active NBA player alive, including LeBron James, a man who has defined basketball culture for 2 decades, stacked championships, MVPs, and records that may never be touched. And here's the part that should have made alarms go off everywhere. She did it while barely playing. Think about how backwards that is. Collectibles usually surge when players are dominating on the court. Finals runs, MVP seasons, iconic moments. Caitlin Clark had none of that happening in real time. No nightly highlights. No stat padding stretches. No championship push. Yet collectors moved harder for her than anyone else. That tells you something important. This wasn't reactionary hype. This wasn't a moment. This was confidence. PSA didn't just show totals either. They released a geographic breakdown, state by state, showing which active athletes were being graded the most. And once you filtered it down to basketball, the picture became almost uncomfortable. It wasn't close. It wasn't competitive. It was domination. State after state lit up the same way. Coast to coast. Red, blue, Midwest, West Coast didn't matter. Collectors everywhere were sending in more Caitlin Clark cards than anyone else. The visual looked less like a leaderboard and more like a landslide election map. One name covering nearly everything. That kind of uniformity doesn't happen by accident. Collectors are famously picky. They don't move as a herd unless the signal is overwhelming. And yet here they were, independently arriving at the same conclusion. Caitlin Clark wasn't just relevant. She was inevitable. And the dominance didn't stop there. She also held 3 of the 10 most graded cards across all sports. Not basketball. All sports. Football, baseball, hockey, everything mixed together. Her cards were being graded alongside names like Patrick Mahomes, Shohei Ohtani, and Connor McDavid. Different leagues. Different audiences. Same collector behavior. That's crossover power. Now here's where the timeline makes this even crazier. The year before, Caitlin Clark ranked 6th among the most collected basketball players. Strong position. Respectable. On track. But not untouchable. Just 1 year later, she jumped straight to number 1. From 6th to 1st. While injured. That kind of leap doesn't happen unless something fundamental changes in how people see you. This wasn't about recent performance. It was about future belief. Collectors weren't buying what she did. They were buying what she represents. The president of PSA addressed it directly. He didn't frame it as a fluke or a spike. He said momentum like this only appears with the most elite athletes. And then he dropped the key line. This wasn't just about basketball anymore. This was about cultural impact. That's the moment the story shifts. Because once a player crosses that line, the sport no longer defines them. They define the space around the sport. Their value isn't tied to minutes played. It's tied to attention. Their name alone moves markets. That's the level Caitlin Clark reached without logging meaningful time on the court. And when collectors, the most patient long-term thinkers in sports culture, start moving this aggressively, the people with real power notice. Executives notice. Investors notice. Brands notice. Because collectors don't chase trends. They chase legacy. And when legacy starts forming early, it sends a message upstream. The message was clear. Something big was coming. And the next group to respond wasn't fans. It was billionaires. Fans argue. Media speculates. Analysts debate narratives back and forth. But executives don't talk first. They move. And when people at the very top start shifting real money, their own money, that's when the story enters a different tier. Because billionaires don't chase vibes. They chase signals, data, trajectories that haven't fully surfaced yet. That's why what happened next mattered far more than most people realized. On December 22nd, 2025, Tim Cook made a move that barely made headlines but sent shockwaves through the business world for anyone paying close attention. The CEO of Apple, one of the most risk-averse, methodical operators alive, purchased roughly 50,000 shares of Nike stock. Put that in perspective. Tim Cook doesn't need upside plays. He doesn't need rebounds. He doesn't gamble for excitement. His wealth is already insulated beyond imagination. When someone like that deploys millions of personal capital into a company that had been publicly struggling, it's not optimism. It's conviction. And conviction at that level usually comes from information most people don't have. This wasn't Apple investing. This wasn't a board decision. This was Tim Cook personally. Executives like him don't make moves like that unless they believe something is mispriced. Unless they see a future shift the market hasn't fully caught up to yet. And that's what made the timing so important. Nike wasn't riding high when this happened. It was under pressure. Analysts were questioning its relevance. Competitors were eating into its market share. The stock had taken a beating. So why step in then? Because rebounds don't start when things look good. They start when something changes beneath the surface. And Cook wasn't alone. Around the same time, Nike's own CEO, Elliott Hill, made a move that spoke even louder. He purchased roughly $1 million worth of Nike stock with his own money. Not bonuses. Not stock grants. Personal capital. That's not symbolic. That's exposure. When a CEO buys into his own company during a downturn, it's not about optics. It's about belief. Because if you think things are going south, you don't buy. You quietly sell. You hedge. You protect yourself. You don't put your own money on the line unless you're confident the story is about to flip. Hill did the opposite. And here's the key part. These two men didn't coordinate publicly. There was no press release tying the moves together. No shared statement. But the timing aligned. Two elite operators, with access to data pipelines most people will never see, made the same bet on the same company within the same window. That's not coincidence. This is how confirmation happens at the highest level. Not through headlines. Through alignment. And shortly after, the numbers started to justify it. Nike's North American business showed real growth. Not projections. Not promises. Actual revenue movement. After years of decline and endless talk about losing cultural relevance, the direction finally changed. That forced a new question. What flipped the switch? Why now? Because companies don't recover by accident. Especially not legacy brands operating at Nike's scale. Something had to be driving confidence internally. Something big enough to warrant personal capital from people who don't miss often. And more eyes landed on the same answer. Caitlin Clark. Not as an athlete alone, but as a catalyst. The market wasn't betting on last season. It was betting on what was coming next. On a moment where sport, culture, and commerce would collide at full volume. On a product, a narrative, a return that could realign an entire brand's identity. And when money moves this way, it's never about nostalgia. It's about leverage. Nike wasn't being saved by a slogan or a campaign. It was being repositioned around a singular force. one that had already proven it could move attention without playing. But to understand why this mattered so much, you have to understand just how far Nike had fallen before Caitlin Clark entered the picture. Because the brand she's about to revive was dangerously close to losing its grip. That's where this story turns next. There was a time when Nike didn't chase culture. Nike was culture. The swoosh didn't follow trends. It created them. From Jordan to Kobe to LeBron, Nike wasn't just sponsoring athletes. It was shaping how sports, fashion, and identity blended together. If Nike moved, the industry reacted. If Nike spoke, competitors listened. But by the early 2020s, something shifted. Quietly at first. Then all at once. Nike's stock began sliding. Not a dip. Not a correction. A collapse. Nearly 60% wiped off its value since 2021. For a brand of that size, that kind of drop isn't noise. It's a warning. Analysts stopped using words like temporary and started questioning whether Nike had lost its edge altogether. And the market wasn't wrong. While Nike was protecting legacy systems, newer brands were moving fast. On running. Hoka. Agile companies that didn't carry decades of baggage. They adapted quicker. They spoke differently. They felt modern. Nike, once the pace setter, suddenly looked slow. Corporate. Reactive. The swoosh started to feel less like dominance and more like history. Inside the industry, people noticed. Designers whispered. Retailers adjusted expectations. Investors got nervous. Nike wasn't failing, but it was drifting. And drift is dangerous when culture moves at internet speed. Nowhere was this disconnect more obvious than in women's basketball. The demand was there. You could feel it building. Attendance climbing. Viewership spiking. Conversations spilling beyond niche circles. And then Caitlin Clark entered the picture and poured fuel on everything. Sold-out arenas. Ratings jumps. Social engagement exploding. The market was loud. Clear. Almost obnoxiously obvious. And Nike waited. Fans expected a signature shoe. A fast rollout. A moment. Instead, silence. Months passed. The biggest draw in women's sports history was lighting up the league, and Nike looked hesitant. Meanwhile, another player, an elite talent, a dominant champion, received a signature shoe first. From a basketball standpoint, no issue. Respect where it's due. From a market standpoint, it raised eyebrows everywhere. Why wasn't the player driving ticket sales, TV ratings, and cultural conversation the one getting the shoe fans were begging to buy? Why did it feel like Nike was reacting to spreadsheets instead of reality? To the public, it looked like another miss. Another example of a brand no longer in sync with what people actually wanted. Social timelines lit up. Sneaker forums questioned the strategy. The frustration wasn't about disrespect. It was about disconnect. People weren't confused about Caitlin Clark's value. They were confused about Nike's hesitation. And hesitation is dangerous when momentum is peaking. Every delay fed the narrative that Nike had lost its instinct, that the company which once anticipated culture was now responding late. The idea that Nike's glory days were behind it stopped sounding like hot takes and started sounding like consensus. That's why the internal pressure mattered so much. Because brands don't just lose relevance overnight. They bleed it out slowly, decision by decision. Missed moments, delayed reactions, safe plays in moments that demand boldness. Nike was at that crossroads. And this is where the story flips. Because while the public saw indecision, something very different was happening behind closed doors. Not panic. Not retreat. Preparation. The waiting wasn't hesitation. It was calculation. A reset of priorities. A rebuilding of innovation pipelines. A decision that if Nike was going to make this move, it wouldn't be half-measured. It wouldn't be cosmetic. It would be foundational. And the moment they locked in, everything changed. Because the Caitlin Clark deal wasn't just about putting her name on a shoe. It was about rewriting the blueprint. That's where this story gets dangerous for everyone else. Signature shoes usually follow a familiar script. A player proves themselves. The brand adapts an existing model. New colorways, minor tweaks, a marketing push, and the cycle repeats. It's safe, predictable, profitable enough. That's how most signature deals work, even at the highest levels. Caitlin Clark didn't fit that mold. When she finally spoke about her shoe, the tone was different immediately. No buzzwords. No rehearsed excitement. Just standards. High ones. She didn't talk about branding first. She talked about feel, balance, performance. The things players care about when nobody's watching. She admitted she's extremely picky about what she wears on the court. Not in a diva way. In a professional way. She referenced Kobe models. Shoes built for precision, responsiveness, and control. That comparison alone raised eyebrows. Kobe's line isn't about flash. It's about obsession with detail. Then she went further. She said whatever went into her signature shoe had to match that level, or beat it. And then came the line that quietly changed everything. New technology. Tech that's never been used before. Built specifically for her. That's not normal. Nike doesn't spin up brand new tech lightly. That takes years of R&D, millions in investment, and full commitment from innovation teams. The same groups that built Flyknit, React Foam, and Airbase systems don't get reassigned for marketing experiments. They get reassigned for pillars. This wasn't a rebrand. This wasn't a color swap. This wasn't Nike testing the waters. This was Nike deciding that Caitlin Clark wasn't just an athlete endorsement, she was a platform worth building on. That's why the rollout started differently. Instead of leaks, there was silence. Instead of early drops, there was groundwork. Then came the Christmas commercial. Simple. Clean. 2 words that captured her entire game and mindset. From anywhere. That wasn't a slogan. It was an identity. She doesn't need perfect spacing. She doesn't need ideal conditions. She doesn't need rhythm. She can pull from anywhere, under pressure, without warning. That's the threat she brings to defenses, and the message Nike is building around her. This wasn't a test campaign. It was a declaration. Nike wasn't feeling out the market anymore. They were all in. The shoe wasn't coming in 2025. It was being positioned for 2026, a full cultural moment, not a rushed release. Time to build anticipation. Time to align media. Time to make the return feel bigger than the absence. Because that's how leverage works. You don't rush when demand is already guaranteed. And this is where it clicked for the industry. Nike didn't miss the moment. They delayed it on purpose. They wanted the shoe to debut when Caitlin Clark returned to the court with the spotlight at maximum intensity. New tech. New era. New narrative. Not a recovery story, a takeover. This is the same company that built empires around Jordan and Kobe. They know what a true inflection point looks like. And they don't commit innovation teams unless they believe the upside is generational. That's why executives started lining up behind the move. That's why investors placed bets early. And that's why media outlets began quietly adjusting their coverage strategies. Because once Nike locks in like this, the rest of the system follows. And the next system to feel it wasn't fashion or footwear. It was television. Television doesn't care about narratives. It cares about numbers. Ratings determine everything. Ad rates. Scheduling. Primetime slots. Networks don't gamble on stories. They chase certainty. And certainty in sports usually comes from championships, rivalries, or legacy franchises. Caitlin Clark disrupted that equation. The first Real warning shot came during something that should have been completely forgettable. A preseason exhibition. Not a playoff game. Not a rivalry. Not even a regular season matchup. Just a tune-up scrimmage against the Brazilian national team. Normally, games like that barely register. A few thousand fans in the stands. Minimal coverage. Local interest at best. Instead, the arena sold out in minutes. That alone was strange. But then ESPN stepped in and made a decision that said everything. They chose to broadcast it nationally. A preseason exhibition. Against an international team most American fans couldn't name. And the numbers? 1.3 million viewers. Let that sink in. That's not just good for women's basketball. That's competitive with championship-level programming. The 2025 WNBA Finals averaged roughly 1.5 million viewers. A meaningless preseason game nearly matched the league's biggest moment of the year. And here's the detail most people glossed over. Those finals numbers benefited from Nielsen's updated rating system, a broader measurement that counts more devices, more platforms, more streams. The preseason exhibition didn't have that advantage. So when you adjust for methodology, the gap basically disappears. In other words, a Caitlin Clark preseason appearance pulled comparable attention to a championship series. That broke the model, because broadcasters plan seasons around assumptions. What's regional? What's national? What's flexible? What's optional? Caitlin Clark erased those categories. Her presence turned any game, at any time, into must-see programming. And it didn't stop there. When she played, ratings spiked. When she didn't, they dipped. Not gradually. Sharply. Networks noticed immediately. You don't need complex analytics when the pattern is that obvious. That's when games stopped being scheduled based on team success and started being scheduled around her availability. Matchups didn't matter as much. Timing didn't matter as much. Weeknights, weekends, competing events, none of it scared broadcasters anymore. Because when Caitlin Clark plays, viewers show up. That's the definition of appointment TV. The kind of pull usually reserved for NBA playoff games, Super Bowl matchups, or generational stars at their peak. Except this wasn't the NBA. This was the WNBA, a league that for years struggled to break through national indifference. Now, networks weren't asking if they should air her games. They were asking how many they could get. This is where 2026 changes everything. The return from injury. The shoe launch. The full weight of Nike's marketing machine. A season of non-stop build-up instead of reactive coverage. All of it stacking together. Under the new Nielsen system, ratings ceilings expand. Games that used to be underestimated now show their true reach. And Caitlin Clark's return slots perfectly into that shift. Her first regular season game in 2025 against Chicago already pulled 2.7 million viewers, measured using the old system. Layer in new metrics, heightened anticipation, and a cultural narrative built over an entire off-season, and the projection becomes unavoidable. 5 million viewers isn't a hot take. It's a line. Over or under, that's the debate. And if she clears it, the conversation changes permanently. A regular season WNBA game pulling NBA playoff-level numbers forces everyone to recalibrate. Broadcasters, advertisers, sponsors, league executives. At that point, Caitlin Clark isn't just driving ratings. She's rewriting broadcast strategy. And once television restructures around one player, the effects ripple outward. Ticket markets react. Teams adjust venues. Social platforms amplify reach. The entire ecosystem shifts. That's what happens when attention becomes predictable. And the next group to feel that shift wasn't the networks. It was the league itself. Leagues are built to be resilient. The entire structure exists to make sure no single player ever becomes too important. Stars come and go. Systems remain. That's the theory. And for most sports, it holds up. Injuries happen. Retirement happens. The machine keeps moving. Until it doesn't. Caitlin Clark didn't just bend that structure. She exposed how fragile it actually was. When she wasn't on the floor, the impact wasn't subtle. Ticket sales didn't dip, they cratered. According to resale data, games without her saw demand collapse by more than 70%. That's not a fluctuation. That's a vacuum. And it forced a reality check. This wasn't about market size. It wasn't about opponent quality. It wasn't about scheduling quirks. The only variable was her presence. When she played, demand surged. When she didn't, it evaporated. That's when the league stopped pretending this was a shared moment. Teams across the WNBA started reacting in ways they never had before. Franchises didn't just promote her games harder. They moved them. Entire matchups were relocated to bigger arenas just to accommodate the demand when she came to town. That's not respect. That's preparation. Courtside seats skyrocketed. Resale prices pushed into territory usually reserved for major men's sports events. Fans who had never attended a WNBA game suddenly knew tip-off times. They weren't casual observers anymore. They were planners. And it wasn't just in the stands. Social media told the same story. The Indiana Fever became the most followed team in the league almost overnight. Not because of a dynasty. Not because of championships. Because one player pulled attention like a magnet. At that point, the math got uncomfortable. If one player can swing ticket demand, social engagement, and broadcast value this dramatically, then the league's growth narrative changes. It's no longer evenly distributed. It's concentrated. And concentration creates dependency. That's why some conversations started getting tense. Not publicly. Privately. Inside front offices. Media rooms. Strategy meetings. Because while Caitlin Clark was elevating the league, she was also redefining leverage. Her games became national inventory. Not optional programming. Networks didn't treat them as nice to have. They treated them as guaranteed value. That's a dangerous shift for any league that prefers balance. But you can't argue with results. Her presence didn't just raise the floor. It raised the ceiling. And once that ceiling is visible, it's impossible to go back. Fans expect it. Sponsors demand it. Media budgets adjust around it. The league wasn't just benefiting from her popularity. It was orbiting it. And this is where the conversation finally leaves basketball. Because when one athlete starts shaping business decisions, media strategy, and league logistics, the question isn't whether they're a star. The question is whether they've crossed into something much bigger. That's the line Caitlin Clark crossed. And the next section explains why this isn't a hot streak, a novelty, or a moment waiting to fade, but a full cultural break from the past. Every breakout star gets the same skepticism. People say it's hype. They say it's timing. They say the novelty will wear off once defenses adjust, once fans get used to it, once the next storyline comes along. We've seen that cycle play out again and again across sports. Caitlin Clark was supposed to follow that arc. She didn't. What happened instead should have killed the hype, and it did the opposite. She missed time. The court went quiet. The highlights stopped coming. If this were a normal moment, attention would have drifted. Fans would have latched onto the next thing. The conversation would have cooled. It never did. The demand stayed loud. In some places, it got louder. Her name kept trending without new footage. Old clips resurfaced and spread faster. Every update about her recovery turned into a headline. That's not how novelty behaves. That's how cultural figures behave. At this point, comparisons shift. You stop lining her up against other guards or scorers. You stop framing her in league-only terms. The better parallel is someone like Tiger Woods, an athlete whose presence restructured an entire sports ecosystem. Tiger didn't just win tournaments. He changed who watched, who paid, who invested. The PGA didn't grow evenly during his rise. It concentrated around him. Courses sold out when he played. Ratings spiked when he teed off. Sponsors followed him, not the field. That's the pattern Caitlin Clark is following. Her influence isn't tied to box scores. It's tied to visibility, to the way attention clusters around her name regardless of context. When that happens, the sport becomes a vehicle, not the destination. And that's the breakthrough moment. Because women's sports have always been framed as a collective effort. Growth through parity. Progress through shared visibility. Caitlin Clark didn't reject that idea. She shattered it by proving something else works too. A single, undeniable pull. Her name functions as a standalone brand. One that collectors invest in. One that networks schedule around. One that sponsors build strategies on. One that fans organize their time around. And the most telling sign? Her absence didn't create space for someone else to replace her. It created anticipation. The demand didn't transfer. It waited. That's the difference between fame and gravity. Fame can be redirected. Gravity can't. At this point, the question isn't whether Caitlin Clark is good for women's basketball. That debate is already over. The question is how high the ceiling really goes when every system finally aligns behind her at full volume. Because so far, everything has happened in fragments. Injury delays, staggered rollouts, partial media buy-in, cautious corporate moves. 2026 removes those breaks. Full health, full marketing, full broadcast support, full awareness. The moment where all the variables that have been building separately finally collide. That's when moments turn into eras. And the next section explains why that collision is already being mapped out, and why the explosion everyone senses hasn't even started yet. By the time 2026 arrives, nothing about Caitlin Clark's return will feel normal. This won't be a comeback in the traditional sense. Comebacks are about recovery, sympathy, rust, questions. This will be about release, about pressure finally escaping after being compressed for years. Every signal is already lined up. The signature shoe doesn't drop into silence. It drops into anticipation that's been building while she wasn't playing. The marketing doesn't introduce her. It amplifies someone everyone already knows. The broadcasts don't explain why she matters. They assume you're already watching. That's the difference. When she steps back on the court, she's not re-entering the league. She's re-entering a system that has been quietly reorganizing itself around her absence. Schedules are ready. Networks are locked in. Venues are prepped. Prices are already climbing before the first whistle. This is the point where momentum stops being theoretical. Look at the numbers we already have. Her first regular season appearance in 2025 pulled nearly 3 million viewers under the old measurement system. That wasn't a playoff game. That wasn't a championship. That was just her being there. Now add what didn't exist yet. A full off-season of build-up. A Nike launch built around new tech. A league no longer underestimating demand. A media ecosystem that understands her pull. This isn't linear growth. It's multiplicative. That's why the 5 million viewer line matters so much. Not because it's a flex. Because it's a threshold. Once a regular season WNBA game crosses that mark, the comparison changes forever. It's no longer framed as women's sports doing well. It enters the same competitive lane as NBA playoff games. And networks know this. They won't hide her games on secondary channels anymore. They won't test time slots. They won't hedge. Caitlin Clark games become guaranteed inventory, the safest bet in the room. Advertisers don't negotiate. They reserve. That kind of certainty changes everything downstream. Sponsors pay more. Teams demand more. Players renegotiate leverage. The league rewrites projections. And it all starts with one return. This is why 2026 isn't the end of a build-up. It's the moment the build-up pays off. The moment when attention, money, culture, and timing collide at once instead of in pieces. And when that happens, it becomes impossible to pretend this was accidental, or temporary, or replaceable. At that point, Caitlin Clark isn't just proof of concept. She's the blueprint. And that leads to the final uncomfortable realization, the one that explains why this story doesn't end with her return, but begins there. By now, the pattern is impossible to ignore. This isn't about points per game. It's not about efficiency ratings. It's not even about wins and losses anymore. What we're watching is a transfer of leverage. Caitlin Clark didn't just rise through basketball, she broke through it. She reached a level where leagues adjust, brands reposition, and media follows instead of leads. That doesn't happen because of one season, or one shot, or one highlight. It happens when demand becomes undeniable across every measurable axis. Look at what already happened without her playing. Collectibles exploded while she sat. Executives committed personal money before the product launched. Networks reshaped coverage before the return. Ticket markets collapsed in her absence. Those aren't coincidences. They're dependencies being revealed. Most athletes are valuable because they perform. A rare few become valuable because they exist. That's the shift. When Caitlin Clark steps back onto the court, she won't be proving herself. She'll be activating systems that have already decided she matters. That's why the moment feels different. That's why the anticipation feels heavier than excitement. This isn't hope. It's expectation. The league expects ratings. Nike expects returns. Networks expect dominance. Fans expect an event. And here's the part people still underestimate. Her influence didn't pause when the game stopped. It intensified. The absence didn't create distance. It created scarcity. And scarcity is what turns stars into institutions. That's why the return isn't the story. The return is the trigger. Once she's back, there's no more debate about whether women's sports can command mainstream attention at scale. The proof will be on screens, in arenas, in balance sheets. And once that threshold is crossed, there's no putting it back. This is no longer a conversation about Caitlin Clark versus anyone else. It's about what happens to the entire system when one player forces every gatekeeper to respond at once. Because after 2026, the excuses disappear. If leagues hesitate, they'll be late. If brands stall, they'll be bypassed. If networks misread demand, they'll leave money on the table. The market already voted. The attention already chose. What we're watching isn't a comeback story. It's a power shift. An athlete whose influence doesn't pause when the game stops. Someone whose absence made the demand louder, not quieter. A player who proved that visibility, leverage, and cultural pull don't need permission. They take space. And the moment she steps back on the floor, everything that's been building quietly snaps into place. Not rumors. Not hype. Reality. The numbers. The money. The attention. The timing. All of it points in one direction. Caitlin Clark didn't just change women's basketball. She changed how the business of sports reacts to inevitability. And this is only the opening chapter. If you're still treating this like a headline moment, you're already behind. Because the biggest shifts never announce themselves loudly. They show signals first. Quiet ones. The kind most people don't connect until it's obvious. If you want to understand what's coming before it hits every timeline, if you want the real signals behind the WNBA, the money, the power moves, and the moments they won't explain on TV, you're in the right place. Subscribe now, not for reactions, not for recycled takes, but to stay ahead of the shifts while everyone else is still arguing about the past. And drop a comment. Does 2026 break the ceiling, or just expose how low it was set? Because once this switch flips, there's no going back.